Hockey Shit Podcast number 15. Book Club. Bobby Orr, My Story. The year was 1956, and I was signed up to play that season for a house league squirt team. I was all of 8 years of age, and as strange as it seems to me now, only 10 years later I would be making my debut in the National Hockey League. But that was a long way off in the future, and something that an 8-year-old could only dream about. It was Royce Tennant who would give those dreams a distinct shape. As the season progressed, I was given the opportunity just after Christmas to move up from House League to coach Tennant's Shamrock Rep Squad. That was my first time representing my hometown, and to say it was exciting would be an understatement. To go on a road trip and play in another town's rink, even if some of those towns weren't too far away, was a huge thrill for an 8-year-old. I've been given a lot of credit over the years for being one of the first true rushing defensemen, but the truth is that the credit should be given to the man who coached me when I was in the squirt division, and to the coaches my whole life who would follow. I was told years later by my coach that what was sold to him on the idea of moving me back was my ability to skate. That may not make a lot of sense to people outside of the game. After all, every hockey player can skate. But even at the highest levels of the game, we talk about guys who can skate. Some players just have effortless acceleration, a sort of fluidity that helps them maneuver out of trouble, get back into position when it seems impossible. There have been some great players who weren't noted for their skating, some of the greatest ever. And there have been some beautiful skaters whose hands never caught up to their feet. Still, it was a huge compliment to be told if I could skate. It's a part of the game that hasn't changed to this day, because skating has been and always will be the main ingredient for any hockey player's success. When you are just an 8-year-old kid, you don't spend a lot of time analyzing different aspects of the game. You simply go out and play. I just knew that as soon as I got my first taste of the game playing defense, I liked it. I was too young to realize that from the back of the blue line, you could see the play develop in front of you better than you could if you played forward. The defenseman's job is to stay back, get between your goalie and an opposing player, and clear them in front of your own net so that your goalie can see the puck. And once you've retrieved the puck, your fundamental job description is to get the puck out via the safest, most effective route. Anything more creative than that is still thought of asking for trouble. No one really thought that a defenseman could actually control the puck and skate with it instead of just clearing it out of the zone. At the time, the two notable exceptions in the NHL had been Eddie Shore and Doug Harvey, but that was about it for Russian defensemen. In recent years, the smaller, smooth skating, puck-moving defenseman has become more common. Guys like Paul Coffey, Erik Karlsson, Chris Letang, and others have become a more important part of the game. Back then, though, there wasn't much room for defensemen like that. The freedom from my coach gave me the confidence to try some things I never imagined I would be able to do. Coach Tennant was allowing me to go back to the pond hockey idea that calls on players to become creative, a quality far too often lacking in the modern game for my liking. Many coaches today would never let a defenseman try some of the things I was allowed to try, and that is a pity. I often wonder if any coach would let me play the game the way I wanted to play if I were playing today. Something tells me I might be collecting a lot of silvers on the bench if I were playing minor hockey right now. Many current youth hockey coaches don't want their players to take chances for fear of turnovers. It's as if their mortgage is dependent on winning at the squirt level. Coach Tennant wasn't afraid of his players making mistakes, and believe me, I made my fair share. I made them, and I made plenty more right through my playing career. But fortunately, the coaches I ran into along the way allowed me to play the game in a wide open style, and for that, I am very grateful. You can never underestimate the importance of events like that in a young person's life. Being responsible for the fans is something I've always taken seriously. Years later, when I was a younger teenager, I attended a summer camp that Royce was running in the Perry Sound area called Camp Wee Gee Wah. One of the guests he invited to make an appearance that particular year was no other than Gordie Howe, and that was the first time I actually got to meet the man who was one of my heroes growing up. And by the way, Gordie Howe is still one of my heroes to this day. As an added bonus, Royce set it up so I could go out on a little fishing expedition with number 9, and it was a dreamlike experience catching fish alongside Mr. Hockey. When the day was done, Coach Tennant asked me, "Well, Bobby, Mr. Howe give you any advice about your hockey career?" To which I replied, "Yes, Coach. He told me that if I got to the National Hockey League, I should look out for just one thing, his elbows." I had other very influential coaches playing in Perry Sound minor hockey, including men like Tom Maxwell, Bucko McDonald, Anthony Gilchrist, and Roy Bloomfield. These men carried on the tradition Royce Tennant had begun, in that I was allowed to play the game of hockey the way I felt most comfortable playing it, and that was with the puck on my stick. Trust me, our coaches didn't engage us in the trap systems back then. Springtime in Canada meant playoffs, always the best time of the year. In early spring of 1961, I was a 12-year-old player just a few days away from turning 13, and I was starting to get some attention from junior and professional scouts. At that stage of my development, I had no idea who was watching me or what they thought of me as a player. I would hear the odd comment that there was a scout from this team or that team watching us, but I never paid much attention to the talk. Looking back now, it is interesting to realize just how very small the hockey world is. For example, one of those scouts who saw me in action that spring was a gentleman by the name of Scotty Bowman. Scotty is arguably the greatest coach in the history of the National Hockey League, and someone whose teams I would play against often in my career. Back then, though, he was an amateur scout for the Montreal Canadiens, a team he would go on to lead to win multiple Stanley Cup championships. Scotty saw me play at a Bantam playoff game in Ganopiki on a Saturday afternoon that spring, and it was the first time he'd ever heard a scene of me. As he told me years later, he was there with a friend that the day to scout a couple of players on the Ganopiki squad. As he tells the story, at about the 15-minute mark of the first period, his buddy leaned over to him as he sat there in the stands and said, "Scotty, I don't know what you're thinking, but I keep finding myself looking at that little number 2 from Perry Sound." Number 2 was what I had on the back of my sweater at the time. Scotty would eventually make something of a courtesy visit to my family in Perry Sound, but an offer from the Canadiens never materialized. They were atop the hockey mountain, and no doubt had even bigger fish to fry than the Leafs when it came to recruiting players. My understanding from Scotty is that he sent in a report to the man who was running the Habs, Ken Reardon, and Reardon responded by saying something like, "We don't sign babies to contracts in this organization." Those might have been his exact words or not, but that was the message, and who could blame him? But my chances of ever wearing a Habs jersey basically never got off the ground. I didn't know it at the time, but there were also members of the Boston Bruins organization who happened to be in the arena to watch some junior games and scout some potential NHL prospects. In fact, the entire front office staff for the Bruins showed up to the Ganopiki. Like the Canadiens, the Boston Scouts had been told to pay attention to those 2 lads from the home team. But apparently, like Scotty, some of the Boston group seemed to prefer my style of play. Instead, Ren Blair was one of those guys. Within a few days of the game, Ren was sitting in the Orr family kitchen. At the time, he was working for the Bruins as a scout, while managing and coaching the Kingston Frontier X in the Eastern Professional Hockey League. Like many coaches and managers I played for throughout my career, Ren told me later he was watching me play that game in the Ganopiki, and it was my skating that caught his eye. Scouts will tell you that any prospect has to show up to at least one elite level skill. The idea is that if you have at least one skill, then the other parts will hopefully round into shape and develop over time. If you have to be identified as possessing one outstanding skill, I suppose being known as a solid skater is what any hockey player would wish for. Both Ren and Scotty noticed my skating in that game and believe it allowed me to control the tempo of play when I had the puck on my stick. That part of my game would not change over the time. I wish I could tell you some secret skills to training techniques that made me an effective skater, but the reality is that skating was something that just seemed to come very naturally to me. I don't mean I didn't put in my time and work very hard at becoming an effective skater, because I did. But if I said I was constantly trying to modify this aspect or that part of my skating, I'd be lying. Changing speed, transitioning from backwards to forward skating, making tight turns, these were all the things I had learned in the Bay. That point is worth repeating. When you're playing 10 on 10, you just naturally lean on how to pivot and change pace to find one spot of open ice. The basics of my skating and certainly the rhythm of my skating seem to have been there from a very early age. I've heard many theories over the years about what it makes an effective skater, and I can't say why some players seem to be better than others. One fellow told me that because I was bow-legged, turning my skates inward within the widths of my shoulders, that I had a biomechanical advantage. Other people theorized that being bow-legged might make a player more susceptible to injuries. You can decide which of those two theories, if either, is more realistic. But there is one thing I know for certain. When Ren and Scotty saw me in action, they couldn't have been too impressed with either my size or strength. Whatever it was that the Bruins liked about me, Ren was given the green light by Weston Adams, the owner of the team, and while the Leafs and the Canadiens could afford to focus on bigger things, the Bruins had no such luxury. They were building for the future. Eventually, in the March of 1962, I hit the magic age of 14, an important birthday for prospective players in those days. And a player had to be 18 to sign a C form, but parents could sign on his behalf once he was 14. Signing that deal would mean I was locked up with the Bruins for the duration of my career, at the option of the team, of course. That may sound unfair, particularly by today's standards, when high draft picks sometimes seem to be able to dictate terms to teams, but back then, that's just the way it was. The junior teams were affiliated with the NHL franchise, and scholarships to American universities were not the rival to junior hockey they are today. There was no way around signing a C form. And in any case, we were happy to do it. After all, it meant being one step closer to the big leagues. That summer, Ren came calling once more, and he had an offer. He wanted me to attend a junior camp in Niagara Falls, and that was fine with Mom and Dad and me. It was a weekend in late August that would be attended by both the Oshawa Generals and the Niagara Falls Flyers of the Ontario Junior Association. That camp had a ton of great players who I would see again in my career, some as teammates, some as opponents. People like Derek Sanderson, Wayne Cashman, Doug Favell, Gillies Marriott, and Bernie Parent were all there. You mention names like those, and you can't help but think a team with all of that talent would have been pretty tough to play against. It was a big step up from Bantam. What Ren didn't realize at the time was that he wouldn't have any trouble convincing Dad or me of the merits of going to the Bruins and playing junior hockey at that season. His problem would be my mother. Mom was not willing to let me leave home before I had even completed grade 8. And no matter what, Ren said, she was not going to budge. As I listened to the negotiations unfold around my kitchen table, my heart sank. I started to realize that all of this probably wasn't going to happen, and that it was tough to swallow. Of course, my mom was absolutely right in her concerns, and eventually everyone saw the wisdom of my mother's love. After back and forth discussion, my dad, the great negotiator, solved the puzzle. Ren wanted me to play hockey in Oshawa, but didn't care where I lived. My mother wanted me at home, but didn't care where I played hockey. So Dad suggested that I spend the weekends in Perry Sound. Then on Friday, on my school after school was finished, we would head to wherever the team was playing. Most of the games in the Metro League were played on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday nights, so my mom could be satisfied that I was doing my schoolwork. I could sleep in my bed most nights. Mom agreed. Ren got all this down on a handwritten agreement letter on letterhead from the Brunswick Hotel where he was staying. It made clear that if I signed with the Boston Bruins, my mother would have the Orr house stuccoed, and my father would be provided with a vehicle up to a 1956 model of my father's choice. Plus, we got the grand sum of $1,000 in cash, and that was a considerable amount of money in 1962. There was also a small signing bonus for me that Ren agreed to provide. The Bruins had to buy me a new suit. You have to understand, I had never owned a suit before, so this was a pretty big news for me. I remember coming home from school that day after day, hoping that the suit would be waiting for me. It was charcoal. When I finally slipped it on, I felt like the coolest dude in town. Apart from the suit and the bonus money, guaranteed only one thing. I would get my shot. I had no lock on a job, just an opportunity, and that was all I really wanted. There was no TV coverage when I signed, no fanfare when I arrived in Oshawa. It was all pretty quiet, and that is probably how it should be. In today's game, we tend to anoint players before they play, so much as a game is a pro. But in my time, things didn't happen that way. Players knew that they would have to prove themselves under fire, and no amount of media coverage would help you land a spot. There's a story I've enjoyed sharing over the years, something that has happened during my first training camp as a junior player. I was on the ice at the old Children's Arena in Oshawa for what could have been my initial practice with the Generals when my stick broke. I headed over to get a replacement. When I reached for the bench, our trainer Stan Weilet checked out what was left of my stick. He looked up at me and said, "What lie?" Stood there for a minute thinking about the question. I had absolutely no idea what the guy was talking about. What he was implying, I had made up the story about breaking my stick. It was clearly broken, and it seemed to require an answer of some kind. So trying to come up with a reasonable response, I blurted out, "Left." Sam must have wondered if the Generals had picked me up after I'd fallen off the turnpike truck. He got a good chuckle out of it anyways. I guess that it hadn't taken me long to show that I had a lot to learn. Note, the lie is the angle between the stick blade and the shaft of a stick. Later that same season, Stan delivered a line that I had never forgotten, and it had something to do with the hockey stick. I had gone to him to complain about some sticks the team had purchased. Once I'd finished my entire little rant, Stan looked at me right in the eye. "Hey kid, it's not the gun, it's the gunner." Basically, he wanted to let me know that the excuses would not be looked upon kindly, and I should just get on with my job. Point made. Passion is a key word for any athlete, regardless of the sport. It's important in any profession, for that matter. I'm grateful I had a deep love for the game, and I'm even more thankful that I never lost it. But it wasn't an easy ride. People who look at some athletes and say things like, "It was no problem for him, he's a natural," are way off base. Although all successful athletes certainly have a measure of natural talent, they all have to get out and put in hours of work in order to bring out their gifts. The fact is that talent counts for almost nothing in the absence of hard work. Plenty of gifted athletes never make it. Other guys work their way to the top with very modest gifts. Whether you're talented or not, the only thing that is going to get you where you're going is hard work. Of course, the final piece of the puzzle is passion. Without it, hard work is just too hard. Any skill or skill set is the result of a combination of a couple things. First, you must have to want an ability to do it. And second, you must have a willingness to pay the price to perfect it. That is where the passion comes in. At the end of the day, it is difficult for anyone to put in the hours of practice required to succeed in a sport if they don't have the internal drive to commit. Of course, they never knew it. Some nights in Oshawa that first year away from home, I would cry myself to sleep. You didn't talk about those things, because no hockey player would. You had to learn to handle all the loneliness. I signed on for it, because it was the price of pursuing my dream. Everyone paid a price one way or another, but I was paying it for my own benefit. As I see now, my family was paying for it too. The good things about competing against older and more mature players is that it makes you pick up your level of play. You have to learn to sidestep checks, how to shift gears to avoid big collisions. You figure out pretty quick you have to keep your head up and not to put yourself in vulnerable positions. You learn those things because you must in order to survive. You might imagine a young player trying to cut his teeth at a higher level, getting so nervous he couldn't play to his potential. The reality is very different, at least it was for me. Being nervous for a game is only natural and probably a good thing, because it means you're getting ready to play. Once I got on the ice, however, and the puck was dropped to start the game, I would calm down and everything made sense. I could almost feel a kind of peace come over me. I was in my element. You get to a place that sports psychologists have identified as the comfort zone. Getting you there allows you to play your game at a particular level. Rookie in Boston, 1966. I never thought that there was any guarantee I would play professional hockey. In my own mind, it was never a lock. There is a depressingly long list of highly touted junior players who never made an impact in the NHL, just as some of the very best players were late round picks or were even undrafted. But the unexpected failures and unexpected success show that scouts' opinion depend on a considerable amount of guesswork. I knew that enough then to know that those people who were expecting so much from me could have been wrong. It was up to me to prove them right. I figured I had served my apprenticeship in junior and that the time had come to move on. But that just meant I had an opportunity to earn a job. It didn't mean that there was one waiting for me. I signed my first professional contract in the summer of 1966. That fall, I attended the initial NHL training camp with the Bruins. Many NHL teams in those days held training camp in cities away from home. In 1966, the Bruins camp was in London, Ontario, at the old Treasure Island rink. At the time, it was the home of the London Nationals of the OHL. I can remember the anticipation as I felt heading down the Highway 401 towards London at the training camp. An athlete in any sport will experience a variety of feelings when he or she is about to be put to the test. I was about to find myself among the best of men of my profession. I was about to enter a world of people I had to read about in the papers or seen in television, and in some cases, these were guys I regarded as heroes. I didn't know what was about to happen. I'd been to training camps before, but never a pro camp. I'd played the game at a pretty high level, but not the highest. I was still not a match physically for a lot of people I'd be playing against. When I was 18, I still was just 5 feet 11 and 165 pounds. I was in great shape that August. Maybe not the kind of game shape ready today players maintain nearly 12 months out of the year, but I had spent the summer with the training camp in mind. I remember jogging in work boots to build up my leg strength and cardio. Sometimes I'd get on a bike and do some cycling as well. I don't know how many sit-ups I did. No one called it working the core back then. I also used a homemade contraption I developed for strengthening my wrists and forearms. It was a brick attached to a rope, which then I tied a short section of an old broom handle. I would grip the broom handle, hold my arm straight out, and roll up the brick to the top, then unroll it down. I knew I had to get stronger if I was going to have a chance in the NHL. As I made my way off the Wellington Street exit ramp into London, I was too late to worry about what I had done to prepare. Whatever work I put in and would have to do, I was absolutely focused on my first pro training camp, and nothing else really mattered. You couldn't have had a finer person as a captain than the chief. He was not a big speech maker, but he came to work every day, and he set the standard with his level of play. He always seemed to set the bar high for us, and it made you want to follow suit, set your own example for others. Much like my parents, Johnny let his actions do the talking for him. That can be no doubt. The leadership was part of his key success for the Bruins would enjoy for years that followed. How he and other veterans received me was very important, because I immediately felt comfortable in my surroundings, due in great part to their help. Here was a rookie who could possibly end up taking one of their spots in the lineup, yet the veterans welcomed me and almost immediately made me feel like I was a part of the group. The hard reality was that my job was to earn a spot on the team, and their job was to keep the spot they had already won. One guy's victory would be another guy's loss. That is the very basis of pro sport, tough as it may sound. But it's not personal, and no one ever held it against me that I was there to take somebody's job. In those days, training camp could last upwards of a month, a lot longer than they do today. Many of the vets would arrive in far from peak condition, and they used training camp to get back in shape. Remember, a lot of these guys held blue-collar jobs over the summer. There was no way they had time to stay in top athletic shape. That's the way it was back then. And let me tell you, the first few days of stops and starts of Blue Rhines were tough. Eventually, it was time to get down to business as we prepared for our regular season debut against the Detroit Red Wings. My father had made the trip to Boston with some of his buddies, and having Dad there meant a lot to me. He would end up being with me for some of the greatest times in my career. I was so excited, I arrived just after lunchtime for the 7:30 game. When I walked into the dressing room that day, I was looking for something very important. Back then, there were no limits on the number of players a team could carry. Especially in the season, we found out whether we would be playing when we walked into the dressing room and saw if the trainer had hung up our sweater. If you didn't see your number, you were watching from the stands. And there it was, my sweater. No one called them jerseys, hanging there in my soul. If I remember correctly, I had worn several numbers, including 27, 30, as well as number 4, for some of the inter-squad and exhibition games during training camp. Back then, there were no names on the sweaters, just the team logo on the front and a number on the back. The number on mine was 4. During that first game, I got into it a bit with my hero. It seems I'd made a couple mistakes early in the game. The first, as he later told me, was that I'd got my elbow a little high on him. It's Gordie Howe we're talking about here. The first, as he told me, was that I got my elbow a little high on him, though I'd like to think I was smarter than that, and then Gordie must have fingered the wrong guy. The second was that I had later spent a split second admiring a pass I'd made to a teammate as I was cruising into the offensive zone. One moment I was looking at the puck, the next moment I was lying on the ice, the victim of a classic Gordie Howe elbow. Mr. Hockey was towering over me, staring down with what can only be described as a stern glare. It wasn't that I thought Howe was a great guy for flattening me, but also it wasn't that I thought I had asked for it. He was just paying me back with a little bit of interest. So as I look up through a maze of legs and arms, I blurted out to my fellow Bruins teammate to the effect of something of, "It's okay, guys. I deserved it." That first game was a victory for us, and I had an assist for my first point in the NHL. The newspaper wrote it up like it was the greatest assist ever seen in the Boston Garden. I think I was just trying to get a shot on net, and ended up accomplishing little more than shoveling the puck towards the goal. My first goal came a few nights later in Boston. Towards the end of the game, I got a point shot past the Montreal Canadiens' Gump Horsley to tie the game. As a rule, I don't talk about goals I've scored, but I will never forget that one. My rookie year has had to share its trials. Like any new player in the league, I had a lot to figure out. Perhaps more than forward, defense is a position you have to mature and grow into. If a forward coughs up the puck, it's a missed opportunity. When a defenseman blunders, the puck often ends up in the back of the net. So rookie defensemen don't get a lot of ice time, which is one of the reasons why they take a little bit longer to develop. There were some frustrating nights. I was aware of absolutely every mistake I made, and it gnawed at me. There were things I could do in junior that just didn't work in the NHL. And when I say the Bruins weren't a great team that year, I'm talking about myself too. There were games when we were shelled, and it seemed like I was on the ice for every goal against. But it beat sitting on the bench, and if it's true that you learn from your mistakes, I certainly had plenty of opportunity that year. But when Coach Harry Sinden kept sending me back out there, and the Boston fans never soured on me, so I never got gun shy, which is about the worst thing that can happen as a young defenseman. Just the opposite. I was actually getting more comfortable by the game. It was my rookie season that I suffered my first problem with my left knee. We were playing against the Maple Leafs in early December, and I was on the attack with the puck, trying to slip by the great Toronto defenseman, Marcel Pronovost. He had the angle on me, but I tried to squeeze him through the shrinking gap between him and the boards. I didn't make it, and he caught me with a textbook hip check that wedged my knee up against the boards. It was a clean check, but my knee was pinched and twisted under the force of the hit and pinned there. I felt an odd twinge of pain, not agony. I didn't require any surgery after that little bit of damage, but I had to sit out 8 games to let it heal. Of course, I was 18, and like a lot of 18-year-olds, I thought I was indestructible. I believed I would last forever, that the odd injury here and there was just simply the cost of doing business. I waited until the knee felt better, and then I was off to the races. But I wasn't as indestructible as I had imagined. That first year in Boston, from a personal perspective, was about finding my way around the league. For the team, it was about rebuilding our program and our identity as a group. I did win the Calder Trophy for Rookie of the Year. I was honored, of course, but not for a moment did I think the trophy made me anyone special. That major triumph, in my mind, was that I'd made the team. I hate losing. I won some more trophies in the years ahead, but I can tell you none of them felt as good as winning. None of them even came close. I scored 13 goals that first season, but not one of them was a game winner, and we only won 17 games. I went back home that summer feeling pretty despondent. There'd been a certain amount of press leading up to my league debut, and expectations had run high in Boston, both for me and the team. But there was no getting around the fact that we had not lived up. A 4-game sweep of the Blackhawks landed us in the final. This is the next season, by the way, as we're going to skip ahead. A 4-game sweep of the Blackhawks had landed us in the final. Our opponent was the St. Louis Blues. They were making their 3rd straight appearance in the finals, so it was a veteran group of players that had a lot of playoff experience under their belt. The Blues had emerged in a short time as the class of the expansion teams, and we knew this would not be an easy series. You need to remember something here that is very important when it comes to sports and championship caliber teams. We had been through 2 very successful regular seasons in a row, and all of us in that room knew that we were a pretty good team, but that meant nothing. As long as we thought that being good was enough to win, we weren't going to cut it. You don't win by being good. You win with hard work and sacrifice. Without that, skill is just potential. Now, our first Stanley Cup was sitting there within our grasp. We won the first 2 games of the series on the road, and we took the Game 3 back to Boston. That set up a very dramatic Game 4. What we had in front of us that day as we prepared for the game that afternoon was an opportunity to achieve something that we had all been dreaming for years. Let me show you how that game developed from where I was sitting on May 10th, 1970. The Boston Garden was packed to the rafters, and everyone had come to the rink anticipating the end of a long-awaited wait for the cup. The Garden was a fantastic gold rink, and the fans in Boston had stuck with us, even when we were finishing last in the league. They were a proud team with great leaders in Scotty Bowman, and we all knew that by taking the Blues out that night was no foregone conclusion. We felt we were in their best game of the series. Just as we expected, the Blues came out and gave us everything they had. We got on the board first with Rick Smith, a defenseman not normally known for a goal scorer, giving us the lead right off the bat. But Red Berenson tied it up with under a minute to go in the first. As the second period began, Gary Sanborn, another Perry Sound native by the way, gave them a 2-1 lead fairly quickly. But Esposito tied it again as the period was dwindling down. It stood 2-2 going into the third, and the already incredible tension was mounting. They weren't going to roll over for us. We barely had time to sit down on the bench before it was off to overtime. I hadn't scored a goal in the series up to that point. The fact didn't particularly register with me at the time because in the grand scheme of things, it just didn't matter. I wasn't there to improve my stats. I was there to help the Bruins win. I could have cared less who scored the final goal, just as long as the player was wearing black and gold. Remember, even though I was a left-hand shot, I always played the right point, so I had to stop pucks along the boards on the backhand. Instinctively, I pinched down. Can't really say why I held the zone, but for whatever reason, I gambled a bit. The St. Louis forward closest to me as the puck came around was number 18, Larry Keenan, who had scored earlier in the game. He got to the puck the same time I did, and I'm sure Larry had visions of scoring his second of the game as he extended his stick and tried to poke it around me off the boards. If he had been able to sneak it by me, it would have been a 2-on-1 or a 3-on-1 in the other way, and I would have been caught. But I managed to get my stick on the puck, and I immediately slid it down towards Derek Sanderson. I'm assuming it's Derek Sanderson, just as Derek. By that time, Turk had followed a shot in behind the net, and when I was just standing below the goal line near the point, a quick pass away, I did what came naturally. Once I chipped the puck in Derek's direction, I went hard to the net. Derek fed it back to me immediately. Glenn Hall's legs opened up in the crease, and bingo, the puck was in the back of the net. I'd like to say I checked first and picked my spot on Glenn, but the truth was simply a bang-bang give-and-go play, and I tried to get a good shot on net. And while I was focused on that, the Blues defenseman Noel Picard got his stick on me to slow me down, but he tripped me up in an instant too late. As soon as I fell back to the ice, Sanderson jumped on me, and the celebration began. Then there I was, following Chief around the ice with him hoisting the cup over his head. No words will ever do justice to the feeling of winning the Stanley Cup. So many things coming together at that moment. There is, of course, the pure joy of getting something you have wanted for as long as you can remember. Many of those games of shinny on George and Bay feature cup winner and overtime goals. To actually do what you dreamed of 1,000 times since you were a kid is feeling like nothing else. Part of the exhilaration is not just getting what you've wanted your whole life, but getting it after years of hard work and after the gut-wrenching challenge of a playoff run. It wouldn't have felt nearly the same having what we wanted to have handed to us. A team victory means so much more. I scored only one goal in that series, so there is no way anyone can say I won the series with that goal. I was just helping out at that point. Next chapter. Back-to-back games became increasingly difficult to handle. I don't just mean the discomfort. Every athlete deals with that. I don't want to make myself into a special case. Guys play with broken bones, stitches on their faces, and their joints taped together by the trainer so they can get through one more game. I've seen guys get up when they should have stayed down and played when they should have sat out. So I'm not going to say I'm special because I've played through some pain. Some guys may play through a bit of more pain than others when their careers, but everybody does it. Like all athletes, I had my own way of doing things. some based on routine, some based on superstition. I suppose some writers have guessed that the reason I went with a single wrap of tape on my blade was because it allowed the puck to release quicker, meaning that my shot would be harder. Others figured that I was trying to make some sort of fashion statement. Those are very interesting concepts, but the truth is much simpler. For some reason, when I came into the NHL, I had it in my mind that there was a rule that all players had to have at least some tape on their stick blade. I suppose it was an easy assumption to make, given that everyone did indeed have their stick blades wrapped in the traditional black tape. In my case, I like the feel of the puck on the blade without any tape at all. So the idea came to me that if I had to have tape on my stick, I would just use as little as possible. Over the years, I used less and less till I was down to a single strip and eventually ended up with no tape at all. Then there was the fact that I didn't wear any socks on my skates when I played. Why would someone not wear socks? The answer is that when I played junior hockey, you were responsible for packing your own equipment, and on one trip, I forgot to include a pair of socks in my bag. The only option I had to go was without socks, and it felt pretty good. I decided that I would just not bother with socks from that point forward. I had been tempted over the years to make up some wild stories about these things, but the truth is they just happened in a natural kind of way, and I never thought really much about it. One thing I took seriously was my routine. Even dating back to my days in junior hockey, I always liked getting to the rink early on game day to get ready. In Boston, that meant arriving to the rink somewhere around 2 p.m. The trainers eventually gave me my own keys because on game day, I often would get there before they did. During those moments, I was alone in my favorite environment and could get ready for the day's game by myself and in my own way. That's a really important fundamental for any athlete, finding what works for you and making it a part of who you are. No two athletes prepare the same. Some of my teammates would get to the rink at 5 p.m., having taken a nap after their pregame meal at midday or early in the afternoon. Others would head out to a matinee movie because going to a show would settle their nerves and relax them for the game. For every player on the roster, there was probably the same number of different ways to prepare, and no one cared how you got ready, just as long as you did indeed get ready. In those days, we didn't focus too much on the mental aspect of the professional sport, or at least we didn't use any fancy terminology for it. But I believe my routine was a great help to me and the mental part of my game preparation. There were two things I primarily concerned myself with during my playing career. The first was to be as consistent as possible at the level I felt I could attain. The second was to focus on the things I can control and not get wrapped up in a whole bunch of distractions. I tried to play the same game no matter who the opponent might be. I didn't think too much about the other specific players or change my game to match theirs. I just played my game and let others worry about systems. It's the same game no matter who you're playing against, so worrying about the other guy is only going to get in the way. Bobby Hull can beat you in so many ways. It was a balancing act to take them all away. There aren't many guys like that in the league even today who can shoot it the way Bobby Hull did. Fast forward the last years. Being a professional athlete is a great way to make a living, but it can be tough when you are not physically 100% and ready to play. Injuries will eventually catch up to you. The weak parts of your game will get exposed pretty quickly, and your opponents will attempt to exploit those weaknesses. And at that point in my career, my lack of mobility was my weakness. And an injury is a weakness. If the other team figures out you've got a cast on your right hand, you can expect them to start slashing your right hand. If you've got a sore shoulder, they're going to hit you every chance they get. If your leg is hurting and your slug is turning right, they're going to get you to your right every time. You can't fake it at that level. The opposition is just too good. And all the skill in the world can't overcome a major injury or a health issue. When I headed into training camp in the fall of 1976 after signing with the Chicago Blackhawks, those were the problems I was facing. I was not able to play up to my own expectations. The knees simply would not allow me to perform in the way I'd become accustomed to. By the time I arrived in the old Chicago stadium, the clock was ticking faster than my knees continued to deteriorate. It is difficult to describe the frustration as I arrived in the Windy City because it really did want to help that proud franchise. I believed that I could. Otherwise, I never would have signed a contract. Looking back, it's easy to say I never should have gone to Chicago, and it was done before I even got there. I had missed most of the previous season, had gone through several surgeries on that left knee, and was hobbling around in pain. The reality, though, was that it wasn't this or that game that had caught up with me. It was the style of game I played. I like to carry the puck, and if you do that, you're going to get hit. That's the way it goes. When you play all out, like I do, I didn't want to sit back. I wanted to be involved. I knew the trade-off. I let the game unfold the way I had since I was a kid. Now those instincts couldn't help me anymore. What I didn't foresee, what maybe no young man can foresee, was that those injuries would acclimate and chip away at me. Throughout my career, I had assumed I was indestructible. I was only 28. Certainly didn't think of myself as old. Even with all those surgeries as the years went by, I felt I could simply put in rehab work once the doctors were finished fixing it, and I would go on playing. It's tough as an athlete when you know what you have to do, but also know that your body can no longer accommodate it. In that moment, you start to doubt yourself. And if you're not a confident athlete, you have nothing. Believe me, it's no fun. It torments you. I feared not playing well every night, and those were the expectations that I lived under from day one. I understood that the key to success in anything is to show up and work hard every night, whether you were 100% or not, and I was determined to do that for my team. There's a problem when you are missing players from your lineup, especially key players, and I always felt that even if I was my absolute best, I should still be taking my shifts. I owed it to my team, I owed it to my teammates, and I owed it to myself. Bobby Orr, my story.